My name is Toshiyuki Belts. I am a researcher sent down to the island of Sarah on cultural studies as a witness to the rehabilitation of recent exile Asdal Estron. A quick summary of my second task is that Mr. Estron found an interest that made him want to stay on Sarah, allowing me to focus on studies. In my time down on the mainland, I was able to get a few accounts on native sightings of our soldiers and scientists in the field, as they have taken to calling us Vulnona, a name that dates back to our original landing given by the Garans. The date is 801, the year 3858. I have gathered these reports between the same year 422 and 703. This first one you should get a laugh out of. It can't be verified with any of the files we have and is too vague. It doesn't match any deployments or operatives we've had, more of just a campfire story. But there's the things that goes bump in the night. I first heard this one from a young elf in Aravel, but different versions were told to me as I traveled. Transcript begins. A group of 10 school kids who had a break for the next few days because their teacher was sick decided to go camping in the woods for a few evenings. They are all 16 to 19, all in late school. 4 are girls and 6 are boys. 3 of them, Alex, Esther, and Fabia, decided to walk some of the hunter trails, hoping to see a few of the animals. So they take the lanterns and set off down the trail. Around half an hour later, the smell of petrichor flows through the camp, kind of mixed with that taste of metal you get after running too hard. Some of them fan out, try to find the source of it before they hear people rushing down the path. Those that went down the trail burst back into their little clearing and dive into the cabin without a word. The rest of them do the same, even shushing one that says the cabin isn't going to keep anything out. The fire is slowly dying, so as the light does too, it gets harder to see out of the cabin. One of them offers to stoke it, but another, Alex, who came running back, firmly says no, and plants himself against the door. They go on to say that they have gotten halfway back and started to hear things, stuff moving in the forest. Other than their lantern, they did not really have anything to see through the pitch blackness. Then, one mentions that they heard something in the bushes, so the boy with the lantern closes the hood and focuses the light, and they see someone just standing off to the side. After yelling at them, whoever it was didn't move, so they just slowly started to walk with the light trained on him. Well, they hear more rustling on the opposite side and turn the lantern to point at it, and it is the same guy just standing there and looking away from them. The boy tells everyone that they had started to speed up at this point, and they begin to hear this harsh, guttural sort of muttering from both sides. Then, directly behind them, the sound of someone stepping out into the trail, and they just started sprinting until the 4 of them came into the campsite clearing. They are all deep in the woods, and that smell around them is really strong. Some of the guys in the cabin say that it definitely had to be someone messing with them, probably elves, and they tuck in for the night. The next day, it is pretty much forgotten, and they decide to take another night. Only strange thing is that Mac's bedroll is covered in this orange fur, but no one really pays it mind. The day and most of the night goes by normally, so they are up telling stories around the fire after it gets dark, and Mac starts on a story about a malicious Vulnona. Not too long into the story, that iron rain smell comes back, stronger. This time, most of them did not notice that it has been with them the whole time. It is so strong that the guys, one of them started to dry heave, throw up all of the ale that they had been drinking. They all rush into the cabin, but the smell is still pretty overpowering. None of them had eaten, and no one wanted to go out to cook, so they counted up 11 rations, one for every person, and handed them out. It doesn't take long, but one of the girls suddenly shouts for everyone to get out of the cabin. They all shoot up, out of the cabin, into the dead of night, with the dying fire giving off a few small licks of flame. Counting themselves, they number only 10 now. Since the class was new to them, no one really knew each other that well. After standing around, trying to figure out who it was, one of the girls, Moira, draws a vet hunting knife and starts to push back into the cabin. There is no one there, she calls out, and the rest of them pile back into the cabin and recount. 10 of them. They explain what happened, and the girl who went with the knife says that one of the guys sitting next to her, Mac, grabbed her and said something that sounded like what they heard in the woods during their walk. So everyone, gathered together, falls asleep to some degree. In the morning, some of them pack up. Turns out that the only ones that wanted to go were the four who first took the walk: Alex, Esther, Fabia, and Moira. Jack was pretty annoyed, because it is his father's land, and he pretty much had to stay with them. Salvia finally notices that after the group left, the smell had stuck around so long had finally left. 6 of them left, and Jack decides he is going to get his uncle's sword and his mother's bow, and that he will be back. After a while, it gets dark and Jack isn't back yet, but one of the guys peeks out of the cabin, says that Moira is back, sitting by the fire. They thought it was a bit strange, since she was one that wanted to head home, but then they started to smell that coppery rain smell again. Carrie asks if anyone is setting it up, but no one says yes. She goes out to get Moira, but halfway there, Moira starts to wheeze and shake. She's trying to figure out if she was the one making the noise. It was pretty clear that the rest of the forest was dead silent. Stepping just out of the cabin, Gios called for the girl to get back into it immediately. Backing up, she gets to the cabin and they close the door and stick a chair under it. Kent, who was watching out the window for a while, finally turns his head, and there is a huge bang at the door. It goes on for a bit, and then they hear the sound of Jack, the one who went to get the weapons, scream for them to let him in. Let me in, stop fucking playing. He stumbles in with a sword, a bow, and a few arrows, and starts to, and turning around, there's no one else behind him. He said that as he came up to the campsite, he saw guys that definitely wasn't Moira, and when she got closer, he said that she turned towards him with these tiny, glowing white eyes, and a little dog nose and an open, drooling mouth. Moving a bit quicker, he mentions that he noticed the thing getting closer, so he turned to bang on the door and unsheathed the sword. After telling the story, Jacques looks around and mentions that there were only 4 other people in the cabin, 2 girls and 2 guys. Gios asks how many were with them when they decided to stay. Another answers 5. Then Jack, who went to go get the weapons. There is a bit of an argument between Gios and Salvia when she accuses him of trying to prank them. He mentions that it doesn't matter what this thing is doing, there was someone that kept slipping in and out of the cabin. Everyone went a bit silent when the smell of coming rain and metal got to the point of smelling like blood and still water. Then there was this voice that came along with a scratching knock on the door. Let me in. Stop fucking playing. Sounding like this strange growling, a weird mockery of Jack. The kids in the cabin scream for whatever it is to stop messing around, but it keeps growing. Let me in. Let me in. The smell fades a while after the growls do, leaving only the sound of something prowling in the woods, like a wolf or cougar. Every so often it comes to the door, asking to be let in, and eventually Jack opens the door with the bow drawn. He saw movement and let the arrow loose, but quickly made his way back into the cabin. It started to scream when he got back in. That sound of a woman screaming bloody murder, like a cougar or a scared fox. In the morning, after everything settled down, Jack mentions that he noticed someone was coming out of one of the rooms after the screaming stopped, while he was keeping guard with his sword, and had dozed off. He didn't think much of it, but counted the people in the room and came up with 6. He didn't want to wake everyone and start pointing fingers, but he stayed up and kept an eye on them. When morning rose, he kept quiet and didn't talk much to anyone else as they all packed up and headed home. He noticed it then. There was a window in the kitchen, one that they had left open. So far, things seemed all right when they didn't say anything, so they continued on like nothing was wrong. He noticed that while they were heading back, he saw one of them slow down and quietly slip into the woods. He seemed happy that it went quieter than it came, but when they all met up for class 2 days later, Kent, Mac, and Fabia turned up missing. Transcript ends. She promised me that, of course, the story is a lot better around a campfire with a pig's blood, a mask, some people being pulled away. But she hoped it was what I was looking for. Now, the first real story is one that I recorded from Antonin Hurst and his father Farron. It happened around April, year 3858, and while they were hunting on the main road between Mildromer and Gaeta, about 3 miles from Gaeta. Transcript begins. My father and I were following the main trail towards Mildromer for a while, so we decided to take a break and catch our breaths. I sat on a log off the trail and my dad stood at the edge of it, waiting for me to get up. I heard some movement and scanned around, knocked an arrow just in case the woods tried to hunt us, but saw a man. He was dressed in this odd, really bulky stuff, like a stiff chain shirt. Definitely something that was like splint armor under a weird vest. He's got a sword and one of these strange L-shaped things that I hear pirates have on his hips. I keep an eye on him because he didn't walk like a hunter or merchant, was alone and didn't have a bow. I wasn't buying that he was here out alone for travel either. He walks up and asked if my dad had seen anything. I'm pretty sure he wasn't talking about game, but wanted to make sure my father didn't see anything he wasn't supposed to. He seemed pretty confident until my dad mentioned that he was here with me and gestured in my direction. I nodded and made a half-assed wave. He seemed to lose interest, very quickly, and the conversation ended. He turned and just cut into the woods off the trail. The strangest thing is that while he was walking away, both me and my dad swear that we saw 3 cream tails sprout from behind him. Definitely not a druid. Transcript ends. The second one was an account from Rosa Viasti, an elven woman from Mildrummer who had been hunting at the time. She said this was somewhere north or through east of the city. It happened around August year 3852 and can be concluded to have been a sighting of Corporal at the time Nova Ford during our Heavy Souls operation. Transcript begins. I do a fair amount of hunting when I am not in the mood to fork out the gold for the meals for a while. I was following some deer tracks and had an eye on them for a couple of days, waiting for a pretty sick one to separate itself and shoot. I usually take my pup, but this one was a solo trip since she was with the medicine man for the time. Without her, it started getting a little creepy, especially when I started noticing the tracks from some sort of canine creature. You could tell because the claws were there too, but they seemed to pace out a bit further than a quadrupedal one. Maybe a canis. Then all of a sudden they got a little smaller and the pacing changed. So I was looking at the trail of a wolf. It was definitely the same one that I had been following, but I had noticed it was getting a bit late, so I put up my blinds and looked up to see what I thought was a thin, muzzled canine break a twig under its feet as it approached. It had this vibrant coat. I'm pretty sure it was a woman and definitely had more than one tail sprouting from its back, but I couldn't count how many. Next thing I know, I am suddenly waking up. I was just lying down. My tent and everything was set up, and I was laying over my firewood, which made me very sore for the day. There was a rip in my jacket, and it was darker than before. I couldn't go back to sleep, actually. I felt pretty rested. Turns out that it was only about 2 hours from sunrise. I'm not sure who set up my tent when it was done differently than I do, and I don't know why I was holding my skinning knife in my right hand when I am left-handed. It sort of unsettles me, but I have not seen that canis, and no one else has said they have seen one like that either. Transcript ends. The third account dates back a little earlier, and can't be pinpointed to a time or a deployment, but happened around the year 3843, and was seen by Luis Ferrero's dwarven grandmother, Halmeline, of the same name. The operative scene was Staff Sergeant Celeste Bennett, and the only one to match the description sent down around the same time. This must have been missed in our last native account study. Transcript begins. It was winter here in Araval, and my grandmother was on one of her occasional morning walks. It was just as the sun began to peak above the trees, she described. She said she had a bit of movement in the brush, nothing that was sneaking, making all the noise as it was. So she stopped and waited there, hoping to get a glimpse of what she thought was a rabbit or a deer or something. She mentioned that she heard what sounded like a sword in its sheath hitting the ground, followed by a short shout of something that sounded a bit Asgarian. The sound, sting, she said it was like thick metal hitting against itself. She saw the orange eyes and light grey face of a fox that had been too big for one, and had had this cold expression that was too sentient for it to be fox. Screaming, she admits, my grandmother took off and told the town guards, who assured her that it was just seeing the Vulnona that they aren't known to attack anyone. Transcript ends. This account is told by a jeweler who traveled for trade between the northwestern, true northeast cities of the Fengari nation. His name was Garen Rolf, and his partner and wife, Julie, shared the experience. This was part of a report from our Green Dive operation in the year 3855, headed by 2nd Lieutenant Gail Lorieva. Transcript begins. It was a normal morning. Got up to start getting ready for the third day in our trip from Kayata to Mildrummer. Woke the guards, Julie, and unhitched the horses. It was a light morning. Breakfast was dried meat, cheese, and crackers washed down with my water skin. Took off, usual trip, not much to it. Walking alongside us, so the guards we hired, about 4 of them, started to hear things off to our right. Yelling, big things snapping, that odd howling, and this loud banging. Couldn't really tell what they were saying, but they lined up on the edge with their weapons drawn and waited. All the snapping and yelling gets closer. Clearly they were speaking in something rough. Reminds me of that Askari language. Then we hear this loud impact, and what sounded like someone getting bumped, and they come flying onto the trail and into our wagon. It broke a few supports, I think. He had a sword, a big dagger or arming sword, and this strange stiff armor, sort of like splint armor if it had cloth strewn around it. The most notable thing was that he looked like a canis, orange but a bit thinner of a muzzle, sort of like the Kenra form. And I probably would have kept thinking that if that is all I saw. Right, well, after him a huge Kinsid came to dive on him. Got a bit distracted from that since another one came not too far off to the side and took out one of our guards. Didn't think he even had time to scream or yell. Another came through the woods on the other side, so this one had another one of those fox things on its back, plunging a blade into the back of the beast's neck over and over again, really going at it while it bucks around. Another 2 came onto the trail and one stared me down. There were more of those fox canis things, and they had these black things in their hands that were barking, these loud banging in these really quick bursts. I didn't have much time to look at them before that Kinsid got to me, snapped the lead of the horses on the way over too. It took my shoulder in its mouth and then just stopped for a moment. I was lucky it was my left and I could still work on my jewels after it all. I don't know what they did because the thing swung me into something and threw me against a tree before going after the guards and foxes. I was really losing it at this point, couldn't really tell what was going on, couldn't really remember. The bangs and shouts and growling went on for a while, but I remember opening my eyes and just one of these foxes walking up to me. I swear, this one woman had 5 tails. I heard the others call, "Just stick him in, let's go." I thought she was going to kill me, just end it. I got up on my one arm, but she leaned down and said, "I am sorry," before sticking me in the neck with something. I woke up, back on my cart, and wrapped up by Julie. None of our guards were there, all killed apparently. She said there were no sign of those fox things either, and the bodies of the Kinsid were just laying there. Somehow our horses hadn't scattered, so we got off somewhere. Lucky, at least. That and they didn't get my main arm, so I could still work a bit while it healed. When we got to Mildromer, I asked around about what we'd seen and was told it was Vulnona. These well-wishing fox spirits with many tails. Didn't really think that was it because what we saw there definitely weren't spirits. Transcript ends. The perpetrator of this next story had already been found and court-martialed for their actions at the time of this, but following is the story from the native point of view. The individual is not to be named, but their actions have been dealt with. This is dated to October 23rd, the year 3853. And happen in the western section of Mildromer. At the very least, protocol was followed to correct any big problems. Transcript begins. A couple of weeks ago, my friend's dad told me a pretty bizarre story that scarred me for life. But 5 years ago, my friend's parents, Alvaro and Ian, were woken up early in the morning to a very loud thud that shook the house. Worried that one of the kids had fallen out of bed, Alvaro went downstairs to check on them. But all 3 kids were sound asleep and safe in their beds. Ian told Alvaro to check the house in case of thieves, so Alvaro checks the doors and windows before going outside to take a look. After 10 minutes of investigating, Alvaro could not find anything unusual outside of from what looked like a multi-tailed canis in the street, but shook it off as lack of sleep. And he went back inside to go to bed. He found his wife absolutely sick with worry and demanded to know where he had gone and what had happened. Confused and tired, Alvaro told her he found nothing and tried to calm her down before Ian pointed out that it had been hours since he had went to check on the house for thieves. Ian had even gone outside to check on him and he was nowhere to be found, and didn't even respond to her calling his name. Unable to figure out what happened, they returned to bed and slept until Alvaro had to get up for work in a few hours. Alvaro is a carpenter, and a few hours of working in the foundation of the house, he noticed his eyes started to feel itchy, and then they started to burn. And finally, after a couple of hours, his eyes burned so badly that he was holding them open because blinking felt like running sandpaper over his eyes. His employees rushed him to the hospital, and Alvaro was treated for second-degree flash burns on his eyes. He was told his burns were like he had gone skiing for hours without the use of blinders or goggles. His eyes were treated with the help of the clerics, and he was lucky to have his vision fully restored. Transcript ends. This one is the most in-depth one I have heard. It has a bit more information, but unfortunately nothing solid, of Lance Corporal Castor Shaw, known as Cast.
Continue.
Who went missing in year 3856 during an expedition in search of the temple entrance on the Fingari Ascari warfront. An elven family, Laura and George Vakrana, cared for Miss Shaw after her squad had been unable to recover her. This happened in Fingari city of Bastion. Transcript begins. We found her at Zaval. The guards wouldn't let her in. Human. She was just limp there, bloody and cut. Looked like an axe had been buried into her chest and she was left for dead. Had no armor and really strange Ascarian-style clothing. She was also really heavy. It took 2 of us to carry both her and the huge swords that she had. Turns out there is a strange metal connected along her back and arms. We thought she was a guy at first. Well, there was a lot we thought. After getting the help of the Teomasian Guild to bring her in, it was clear we were dealing with something different. We actually lost her when we got her onto the table. It gave us a scare when her skin sprouted this orange fur, and her face changed into a sort of thin canices. If it wasn't for Mother Jacqueline there to handle the situation, I think she would have stayed that way. The mother had George start pumping her chest. This is when we found out that it was a woman, as she prepared this milky cleansing in a needle. It's a wonder that she had something so difficult to make. Lucky, too, I guess. She slipped the needle under George's palm, and pretty quickly after, the blood started flowing again. Almost immediately, Jacqueline raised her hand to the sky and called upon Vestia's power to heal the creature. Later, the mother said whatever power came to her aid at the time was not Vestia's. It was colder, felt distant, calculating. Anyway, the fur went away quickly, but I can't say if much else happened during that first day, since the mother sent me out to get supplies to better care for her. I came back and she's wrapped up on the table, and the mother is cleaning up all the blood and telling George how to handle changing the wrappings. She finished up and left, telling us that she would be back every other day to check up on their strange charge. The days went by pretty normally outside of feeding and changing the thing on the table. It was about 4 days later that she woke up. I was cooking albondigas at the time, and the smell must have roused her. I heard the slap of the table lifting up and hitting the ground, and turned around to see her yelping on the floor. She had this sort of rough, masculine voice that I'm sure mixed with her looks and made a lot of people think that she was a guy. After refusing to be laid back on the table, I helped her into a chair, where she explained how she got such a deep cleave in her. Turned out she was a defecting Ascarian that caught an axe after taking out a few of her squad. She passed out and woke up later, struggling to bleed, like she was while telling this story, and crawled to the stone wall for help. She never really told us what she was after. I told her we saw the snout and all the fur. She did say that her name was Cass. Eventually, I guess she understood that the situation or got used to it and eventually changed back to the fox thing. Looked a lot like a canis, but did not match any other breed we've seen. She stayed for a month as she healed, but said it was safer that she go after George and I came back from shopping to a torn-apart house. Apparently, thieves came in, and Cass made a mess of things trying to take them out. She took that huge sword and sort of lugged it over her shoulder. So I could see the strain from what was probably her injuries. Saw her around the city for a while after that, but she sort of disappeared around a week ago. No idea where she went, but I don't think anyone else found out about her. Transcript ends. It is safe to say that our operations have had their discoveries, but with the limited tools our operatives have, they have done an acceptable job at covering up when they make a mistake. I would recommend taking a few more measures to avoid the native populace unless absolutely necessary. We'll continue following up on the natives that report similar circumstances, but I will be turning my attention back to the native folklore as before. Ma'am, there is one more thing though. Some of the people reported on a different creature. One we have been able to determine isn't us. I wanted to make a report on the stories I got on their sightings as well. I think it is pertinent for our people to know about this potential threat in case they run into it.
Send the report and I'll get it to General Vargas.
Yes, ma'am. I will make a report on it after this meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Belts.